Our next panel is on diversity and inclusion, both within and outside the classroom. This panel will be moderated by Mr. Sachin Malhan, who is the co-founder of Agami. He is a 2002 graduate who co-founded Law School Tutorials and Rainmaker / Vahura and led the Changemakers program of the global nonprofit Ashoka. Over to you, Sachin.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. I think that conversation, the previous panel could have gone on for a while. And I think it would have gotten even more interesting as Saturday night went on. Unfortunately, there are limitations on time. I think that that discussion did touch on aspects that relate to this panel as well. So I'm hoping that we can pick up some of those themes as we get into this panel. And, if we can't, then, we'll pass the load on to Dave and his panel so that we can get to some of them. So just a little bit about this panel on diversity and inclusion in law school. Like all good alums, we went straight for the title itself, and we felt that, it really should be exploring equal opportunity, diversity and inclusion in legal education. We stayed true to our character and fixed it at the kind of fundamental stage itself. Some thoughts before we get started with today's panel. We know that legal education is an important enabler for social and economic equality, development and growth. And it is more than that, it's a platform to build a society that is based on knowledge, learning, and egalitarian values. Several efforts have been taken to make legal education non-discriminatory and more accessible, but there are still systemic obstacles and barriers that exist. And we know the symptoms of these, but these have existed for some time. Society itself is vastly unequal and diverse, and very often we see that reflecting within the law school. So the task in front of us is quite substantial, and it's not just about the classroom, but it goes beyond that, goes to institution and community as well. Done well and done right, legal education can provide an opportunity to experience and understand group inequalities and the differences in backgrounds, cultural contexts, experiences, personal choices, and personal challenges. And ultimately, it can create lawyers and social leaders and many more varieties of the kind of people that law school has turned out to become much more nuanced in their understanding of society and people. And I think this is something that our society today could do a lot more with. This session has been formulated to ask questions and push those boundaries of equality, non-discrimination, inclusion, and diversity within the classroom and the institution. What should the NLSIU do to become more egalitarian, inclusive, and diverse? How can NLSIU take the steps to raise the bar and become a standard bearer for what equality, inclusion, and diversity in this area looks like? I think there were some points that were mentioned in the previous panel around inclusion and the full extent of inclusion, which includes also viewpoints and perspectives. So let's just carry some of those insights as they have broadened our minds into this panel, so that we don't constrain some of these definitions artificially. The panel today that we have represents a very diverse set of viewpoints. We have people representing different socioeconomic perspectives, disability, sexuality, caste, language, and ethnicity. Professor Sumit Baudh is Associate Professor and Executive Director of the Center on Public Law and Jurisprudence at Jindal Global University in Sonipat, Haryana. Amba Salelkar is a lawyer who works in capacity building and inclusion, particularly around disability, mental health, and gender, and she's based in Chennai. She's also a Bridge Regional Fellow at the International Disability Alliance. She's a 2006 graduate of the National Law School. We were having a discussion on whether we should mention the years that people graduated, and we decided that maybe we should just say ancient, old, and new. But in some cases, I have permission to mention which years they graduated. Vivek Divan graduated from NLSIU in 1994. He's the coordinator of lawyers. He was the coordinator of Lawyers Collective HIV/AIDS unit from 2000 to 2007. And he was a part of the core team that devised and litigated the NAS Foundation PIL that challenged Section 377. He presently heads the Center for Health, Equity, Law and Policy at Indian Law Society, Pune. Swati Agrawal works as the Director of Operations at IDIA Charitable Trust. She's been working with IDIA for close to 5 years now. Before that, she was a banking and finance lawyer, and she also writes extensively on invisible illnesses and mental health. Let me open up this conversation by going to Sumit and asking, Sumit, what do you see as the biggest fault lines of inequality, discrimination, and inclusion?
Hi, Sachin, and thank you so much for organizing this. Thank you to the Alumni Association. As we delve into the topic of equal opportunities, diversity and inclusion, and in addition to, the year that we would have graduated from the institution, in addition to professional qualifications and experience that we might come to, I think there is one component that might be valuable to our discussions, which is that of personal experience and locations. And in those spaces of personal experience and locations, I want to introduce myself as somebody who is Dalit, somebody who is gender non-binary, somebody who is single and child-free. And each of these locations could be, locations of liberation, but these are also locations of prejudice, stigma, and discrimination. And as we pursue our lives, both with what we confront on a regular basis within our careers, as also with the experience that we gather from the institutions where we were enrolled, as well as what is followed by way of our career pursuit, all of that is then enriching and it informs us and is then able to provide us any insights into bringing some of those ideas to discussion. So what are the fault lines? I think some of these fault lines would be something which would be easy enough for most of us to anticipate and imagine and know that, fault lines such as caste, class, sex, sexual orientation, gender variance, mental health, language, all of these could be fault lines in which the project of equality and non-discrimination might somehow slip the attention of the institution. But I think the idea of ability and merit, something that is imminent in the very pursuit of a select student body through an entrance exam, is something that might be little recognized or little discussed or little troubled. So that perhaps needs to be elevated, because the idea of ability and merit that not only decides the entry of students, but somehow influences the ways in which students are going to be received within the institution. If the previous practices at the National Law School had included the practices of assigning certain roll numbers to students based on positions acquired in these entrance examinations, and notwithstanding the discontinuity of practices as those, we know that informally there are repugnant practices as what are called rank families, in which students are identified with the rank that is acquired at the entrance exam, and that rank then remains with them for the remaining duration of their law school. And questions could be raised about what could be done institutionally to undo these kinds of informal practices amid students. Does it tantamount to a form of ragging? Something that is not recognized as conventional methods of ragging, but if this rank family is something that is going to continue, ways in which students are received in the institution and is going to exclude a segment of students in the scheduled caste and the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe categories, then it becomes important for us to address some of these informal mechanisms in which rank and merit continues to be predominant in the ways in which students are received. Class is also something that needs to be understood, especially as there are ongoing notifications from the NCBC, the National Commission of Backward Classes, and we know that the National Law School is not a recipient of those notifications yet. When we consider questions of caste and class-based inequalities, and especially as we turn to the classroom and we discuss constitutional law, then in what ways are we addressing the caste and class-based inequalities? Are the questions of reservations for backward classes, and quite aside from the formality of what should be the percentages, or whether or not it should be within 50% or can it exceed 50%, aside from that, are there ways in which the institutions might be engaging in discussions within classrooms And then other than classrooms, of course, beyond classroom, are there ways in which the institution is able to make explicit its position on various ways in which various segments of reservations operate. I'm just going to stop there because I know that we have our fellow panelists who are going to be addressing this question in many ways. But the 3 points that I've raised is one of ability merit being the opening kind of entry, which is going to then influence. And then other 2 categories that I've just touched on is caste and class. Back to you, Sachin.
Thank you, Sumit. And, I think it touches on this theme that there are so many practices that just seem so innocent, but they have a dark side to them, and we don't realize what the implications are. And it's, it's one thing to recognize that, we were part of these practices, but how do we respond quickly and institute a new set of practices or call out certain practices that just don't work? Sometimes we wait too long. Vivek, I want to come to you and just to continue that thread of identifying the fault lines that you've seen, that affect inequality, discrimination, exclusion. What are your thoughts on this?
Sure. So first of all, thanks to the Alumni Association for inviting me to be on this panel. I do want to say something, Sachin, before I get into responding to your question, which is that I think it's important. I mean, I think a lot of this ultimately comes from one's personal experience also. And how one has dealt with, some of this from that vantage point, but also at a larger scale institutionally, et cetera. And I do want to say that I think it's important for me to acknowledge a couple of things. One was the class and legal privilege that I experienced law school with. I think it was exceptional for its time. I think that it was something which I became conscious of while at law school, but certainly not immediately. The other aspect that influenced me even more deeply was my queerness. And I think both these things, the privilege and the queerness, are obviously a mixed bag. I think they informed me in my time there in a good way, but also in ways that were distressing to me and I felt pretty sorry about, actually. I say this with a purpose, of course. And I think it's fortunate that friendships at NLS and beyond, and unfortunately my work around health and law and sexuality and 377, etc., have lent a far more nuance to my understandings of that world which is around me, and particularly the vitality of diversity and the need for inclusion. I do feel, and I say this with the reason that I think what was certainly, when I look back, missing in those days, and which I know was missing also at moments more recently, is the understanding of diversity and inclusion with an empathetic kind of perspective. I think for me, I mean, if I was a teacher, and I have been a teacher at some point in my life, I think empathy with your student is fundamental to actually getting getting a deeper understanding of where they come from and why they come from where they come from. And so, I'm speaking in broader terms, but I think there's a core value here, which I think we need to hark to. I also believe that it's a constant endeavor. I don't think that just because these are relatively better times for queer people on campuses because of the goings on in the Supreme Court, that these queer times are going to always now be relatively better. I think it's work that needs to constantly be happening. I think, of course, that this is a matter of rights. It's fundamentally about rights, about inclusion and diversity is about rights, but I think there's a lot to be said in us trying to understand and increase the understandings of each other and our differences. I have a couple of more points to make. One is that I think when you talk about fault lines, I think the fault lines, I'm more interested, I mean, I think Sumit has done well to really touch on some of the themes that diversity and inclusion include, but I think the fault lines also are located at certain places. I think they're located within the faculty often. I think they're located within the administrative wing of an institution. And I think, unfortunately, they are located within the student body and the interaction of these sites with each other. So I think the challenges and the fault lines lie then in actually a really concerted effort and a constant effort really at identifying where these locales are and really, kind of buttressing that with some serious kind of efforts around diversity and inclusion. There's one thing I want to say, which is more a reflection, and I think it is a challenge also, which is that, law school is unavoidably informed by the profession it is linked with, which is the practice of law, which is a deeply hierarchical, deeply gendered, deeply inaccessible, and often elite context. I think this reinforces a rigidity that boxes things and us in certain ways, and our conduct in certain ways, and what is acceptable and not in certain ways. And it's often at odds with ideas of inclusiveness. So I think, there's some unpacking for us to do when we think of the system of the legal profession or law. And I think it might have to start there. I think this is a bit of we could do the usual stuff. We have good policies in place. We do a few refresher courses for faculty and all, but I think there's a mindsets change, which is at a pretty much deeper level.
It's actually really interesting, the fact that the point that you made about the relationship with the profession, because I just feel that isn't spoken about enough. It's almost assumed that, okay, that's something you deal with downstream, and we actually don't talk about that enough. So, and even, I appreciate in the previous conversation, in a different context, where Uma brought up this point about, we have to see what's happening with the profession, and somehow those conversations, what's happening with the profession and what does that mean for legal education? I'd love to see more of that conversation. And of course, spanning not just the nature of the practice and things, but also aspects like you're mentioning, fault lines within the profession. Thank you, Vivek. Maybe we can, there's a lot of rich stuff there, which I'll come back to, but let me move to Amba. Amba, what are the fault lines that you see? You bring a perspective, a very unique perspective, having worked in disability and inclusion for a long while now. And I'm just really keen to hear your take on this.
So, I think, since my co-speakers have situated themselves, I will probably make references to, the aspects of my identity that are relevant, in the course of while I'm speaking. But, I come at this from someone who came to law school from a relatively smaller place. So I'm from Goa. We didn't have a lot of people coming in from law school and stuff. I still remember when I went for our interview, I found out that there was something called NLSAR and something called NUJS. Like, I had no idea that those things existed. And I knew that people were doing coaching classes for law school. And I was like, wow, this is 2001, right? So it was really interesting. And there was a strong culture shock for me. And now I know that, at that time I felt kind of isolated, but now, and I think Swati is going to talk about, reports like the IDIA report, which have really spoken about, like what the experience of students have been. And I think that it's really something that is important for us to also, acknowledge that there are experiences which are being generated right now that we need to take into account. I want to talk about two things in terms of fault lines. One is I want to address the culture of the campus itself, which Sumit and something Vivek has already spoken about. But, there is an enabling of discrimination and exclusion that happens on campus. A lot of it is related to student experiences who are just young people on campus who are making decisions that other people think are pretty unwise. But also looking at, students who experience mental health and distress, or students, particularly women, who are experiencing sexual or gendered harassment or intimate partner violence from their fellow students. And these three things can be linked. And I can speak to that from my personal experience as somebody who experienced this in my first year to my third year of law school, and subsequent, mental health related issues in that. And what I want to sort of drill in here is that it's really hard on campus to talk about one's vulnerabilities and make a cry for help, because sometimes the vulnerability of a student is deemed to be at odds with threats to reputation to the institution. Like we see the kind of discourse that happens every time there are reports of suicide or self-harm that comes up. And it's really something which we really need to introspect on. Students who don't get the support that they need, either whether it comes to finance, whether it comes to other aspects, which the SPA president spoke about, and I really, really appreciate his intervention. It just makes things worse. If you're already experiencing, you're already in a bad place, this just is another step towards isolation and really bad consequences. But I also want to talk about the need to move towards universal design in learning as a core principle of the institution. And I know that there's been a lot of discussion in the previous panel, a lot of which needs a lot of unpacking. But also, like, what are we as an institution and what are the principles that we promote? And I would like to present here that we really need to talk about universal design, which is linked to things that the panel spoke about, accessibility. And it's not just about infrastructure, it's also about learning. It's about ensuring that all processes and systems which are related to students are designed in a way which accommodates for the diversity of students, including learning styles. And when we talk about inclusive education, it's really looking for all. I think a really important point, again, I'm referring back to the SPA president's point on English and the fact that that really influences your experience on campus. And we know that there are some groups of students who do have legal remedies, or the institution is legally bound to support them. If you talk about anti-discrimination, if I talk about kids with disabilities, I'm talking about the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act. But students from non-English speaking backgrounds, students who don't have the exposure that their peers have, students who are first generation learners in their families, don't have those kinds of statutory things to fall back on. It's something that we need to think about. And it's really important that we institutionalize policies and processes which uphold all forms of diversity among students. And it does. And this is something that I want to stress. It's not something that's easy. It does involve interference in the way that teachers are teaching. It involves going back and looking at the way some of us have been teaching for 18, 20 years, and that this might be exclusionary to some students. But the fact is that it's something that we need to engage with if we're really serious about not leaving people behind. So the two fault lines are really looking at campus culture and looking at, incorporating a wider understanding of what universal, I would say, like, there's a lot of emphasis on this being an institution of excellence, but excellence is not something that we can impose on students to bear the burden of. We need to do our bit as an institution. Thanks.
And Amba, I think sometimes it can seem like there are too many components that are not designed correctly. But we've seen sometimes whenever it comes to large institutions, identifying as horizontal principles that need to work in whichever subsystem you're looking at. So if you're looking at admission, there are the same 6 principles that if you're looking at the classroom experience, and the same 6 principles that if you're looking at the developing of leadership with faculty and administration. So I think principles will become a really important aspect of any form of overall redesign. Thank you, Amba. And I'll come to Swati. I know, Swati, there are threads from Amba's conversation I'm sure you're itching to pick up, especially because I know there's a report that IDIA has worked on fairly recently, which has revealed some of these insights. Swati, over to you.
Thank you, Sachin, and thank you for having me here. I just wanted to start by talking about some of the entry barriers that people face when it comes to law school, before I go on to talk about inclusion and barriers there. So first barrier that we don't often talk about, and something that we try to address at IDIA, is the lack of awareness about law school, legal profession. And they're like, if you are a first generation learner, like Amba is talking about, there's a lot of pressure in India that you should go and do something like medicine or engineering, and legal profession is not considered as either lucrative or a good profession, so to say. There are a lot of negative notions which are attached to it, and people just don't know about national law schools in remote areas and among underrepresented communities. So that's a gap that we really need to kind of bridge. And it could be through anything, like just like advertisements about admission process in local newspapers, for example. What we do is we go and do sensitizations in all in different regions across India to spread awareness about law and legal education. And carrying forward the discussion from what SBA president said, he raised some very good points, which we saw in the diversity report that IDIA has come up for 2018-19 as well, which looks at first year students across leading 5 national law universities and does a comprehensive survey about their diverse backgrounds. So firstly, most of the students were from the Hindi speaking belt of India. And like he mentioned, there was very low representation of students from Northeast. There was also very low representation of students from religious minorities, which is not something that has been mentioned so far. And there was, and the kind of background of the parents was also telling when it came to the report. So if we take these things into account, an important aspect that comes up is financial exclusion, which doesn't just start at the high fees of the law school, but starts from the very process of a very elitist law entrance examination, whose fees is higher than most entrance examinations across country, which emphasizes on English as a language to a very large extent. Now, even the GK component has huge parts of reading comprehensions in it. So that is the second entry barrier, and the inclusion barrier that has already been spoken about by Sumit and Amba to some extent is the socio-cultural exclusion of students on campus, which means that if you're from a diverse background, you do not, you fall behind in academics because of the ways the courses are being taught and the kind of reading materials that are being compiled. You fall behind in co-curricular and extracurricular activities because, again, emphasis on language. If you're someone with a disability, moot course require you to rely on books and written submissions which are in physical form of the other party and things like that, small things like that. And also how we interact on campus. So these are the 3 main points that I wanted to bring out as far as fault lines are concerned.
Thank you so much, Swati. And I know that there are other suggestions you have on how we can mitigate some of these. I'm already seeing in the chat and the Q&As, people saying, should we try this? Should we try that? I cannot echo more strongly the English aspect. In my experience, and this is dated because this was 2003, 2006, I was in a lot of small cities in the country, and this was like the biggest thing, you know, main English nahi bol sakta, you know, and you know, how is that going to work for me? And that was so intrinsically tied to, am I good enough to do this, which is completely the wrong association. But this was absolutely the single biggest thing. And we have to, it's 2020, so it's been a long time. We've been sort of going down this rabbit hole. Let me come back to Sumit. Sumit, I want to start looking at, you know, what are the ways we move forward on this? How do we solve for this? So I have a request, which is, you know, just because we're going to come short on time, we are running a little late overall on the event. Can we, you know, as you start to address, you know, how do we solve for some of this? Maybe towards the end of, you know, your inputs, everyone, if you can just identify one of those that you think is the most pressing. You know, so please do, I would love to hear your sense of how we can, what are the pathways and which one do you think for now we should prioritize? Sumit, let me start with you. Sumit, you're muted.
Sorry, I wouldn't know how to prioritize these because I haven't thought that through, but I'm going to try and do that. First of all, the English. While we were enrolled at the National Law School, there was a program that required some of us to attend a English school, a program that was much stigmatized because, you know, it was more of a stigma for students to actually go and attend this school because it was based on a test. Those of us who cleared the test, yay, great. And those of us who didn't were stigmatized and shamed. And I don't think that something like this can be done one-off, like one trimester or even for the first year. And it's not even something that, you know, as a regular taught course. Perhaps we could look to models in other parts of the world that have things like writing centers. Writing centers have writing experts with whom we can regularly check in. When I have a project submission, I don't need to go through the anxiety of whether or not my English is something that's going to pass, right? Before then, I should be able to check in with a writing consultant, with a writing center. So it might be an idea for the National Law School to consider, to have, as we consider, you know, research centers, to have a writing center that's going to have a team of writing consultants. Going to a writing consultant for me was a bit like going to a therapist, because, you know, it was so personal. It was something that really helped me develop my English writing skills. So I think that that's something that the institution might consider as setting up as a resource, not just in the first year, something that's going to be true for all students at all times, and perhaps prioritize those students who need it the most. So if we're going to allocate these number of hours to all our students, perhaps a greater number of hours of these consultation can be provided to students who need it more. Secondly, data collection, because it shouldn't be a matter of student initiatives as the ones led by, Chiriyu and Sanjana, and Spadika and Harjas, to do a kind of an exercise in which we go about mapping and charting what are the fault lines, what are the numerical figures, and it shouldn't take an EPW to publish it, because much of this should be done on a more regular basis within the institution. By data collection, we mean both quantitative and quantitative empirical evidence, as well as qualitative ethnographic evidence. But this is something that the institution should be doing on a regular basis. And third and last point is something that's going to be, I'm going to take a cue from something that Vivek said about the fault lines, not only within the existing student body, but also within faculty and administration. So the institution could have a sense of what is the composition of faculty in terms of its caste, in terms of its language sets, in terms of its regional locations, various many parameters that we use for gauging and having a sense of diversity amidst student body. And as much as the works of Chiriyu, Spadika, Sanjana, and also the works of IDIA have looked into, have gained insights into this diversity of student body. I think the next level of intervention that legal education in India might need to look into is the very composition of itself, the very composition of faculty and administration, and this is not being done. And we need to have a sense of who are the legal academics in this part of the world. What is the composition of legal academia in India? So those are the 3 points. If I were to prioritize, perhaps I would prioritize the English Writing Center, only because it has come up in such a major way, and it is something that students really struggle with on a regular basis. So if I absolutely must choose one of these 3, I would choose the English Writing Centers.
Yeah, and maybe prioritize is not the right term, but like what can we do immediately? And if you see the conversation that has happened in the chat as well, you see, even though we don't have the exam anymore, we still have it as a major source of self-doubt in the first few years. So I think that is on top of everything else. If there's something we could do, that would be really useful. Thank you, Sumit. Amba, I'm going to come to you because there are elements of what Sumit has said that relate to that system, relooking at the system constructively. Amba, what are your thoughts on what are the pathways we can take and which ones appeal to you the most?
I think that, what Sumit, I fully follow what he said. And also, I'm looking at systemic issues in terms of the way we're framing classes, whether online or offline, because right now, under COVID, existing inequalities threaten to blow open, right? If you have to manage an internet system at home and nobody in your family knows how to operate a computer except for you, and things go south, it's what are you going to do, right? So whatever we're doing, however we're framing classes, the materials that we're using, the question papers that we set, creating these safe spaces for students to ask for accommodations where they need it is something that we need to, these are things which we need to do to solve for these issues of inequality. We need to look at standards on procurement and infrastructure. I know that they spoke about infrastructure needing so much of money, and how you can budget for it without considering accessibility is interesting to me. But it's something that we need to do. But also we need to make sure that we have an equal opportunity policy in place which spans everyone on campus to make sure that we are gearing towards full participation and not just anti-discrimination. We also need to make sure that when we're talking about career trajectory, someone is talking about why people don't get into litigation. I was the only person in my batch who went into trial litigation. The 3 people who taught my batch were great, but they were all men. And I was not from a family legal background, and I couldn't find anyone as a peer support, like somebody like me with my experience when I was practicing, and it was super isolating as a trial lawyer in Bombay to work like that, and I think it's something which we need to think about. We can outrage as much as we want about people not going into litigation, but the reasons why, and someone mentioned that in chat as well, we need some introspection. And I think regarding mental health, the one thing that we can offer as alumni is honesty regarding our experiences on campus. Every time there's been a publication, Sumit wrote something a few years ago, I think, which I remember it generated a lot of discussion. And the thing is that those of us who can speak about our experiences should, because it just creates a little less isolation for people. On campus, it's super isolating. People do not feel comfortable enough to come forward. People spoke about sexual harassment between peers. I think alumni have a huge role to play in sort of coordinating that sort of peer relationships to do that. In terms of what I would prioritize, right now, everyone is at home. I think we should just look at the way we are conducting courses and looking at where we can make sure that it's more universal in its design. And I would be happy if anybody wants to chat offline about this to take this forward.
Amba, your point about sharing those stories, I think that even the alumni experience is a resource, right? Unlocking that as a resource, that what people experience, why, is a huge thing. So, great point about, just being able to talk about it and being able to reach out across batches and have those conversations. Thank you, Amba. Swati, would you like to continue reflecting on this? What are the things that can be done, especially based on some of the data you were sharing and some of those priorities that you had outlined?
Sure. I think the main priority, the way I see it, should be that when a student from a different diverse background, which is not your usual elite background, comes to law school, they do not feel excluded. So there's greater assimilation, socio-cultural inclusion of students from different backgrounds. And now how we can achieve it is through a variety of ways. So what we do at IDIA is we provide mentorship, we provide academic support, we also help them get internships because they do not have the kind of capital that someone else with contacts would have to get internships or job interviews, etc. So what can be done is that we need more academic support programs in law school for first few years at least, and that will also help with people dropping out of law school or failing years and things like that. We also need institutional policies that provide sensitization, whether it's part of orientation program, whether it's part of your curriculum, however you want to do it. They sensitize not only students, but also faculty. And we need to punish discrimination or look down upon discrimination on campus very seriously, because our study also showed that students who are from a diverse background faced a lot of disparaging comments and remarks from the students as well as the faculty. And this is just not acceptable in an institution that talks about equality, justice, rights. We need programs which encourage students becoming leaders and taking ownership of using their legal education as a tool to fight against injustice and maybe going back to their own communities, which will give an incentive as well to students from diverse backgrounds to come and join law school, because legal education and law is a powerful tool. And so these are some of the things that we can do to fight this social culture exclusion in law school. And I think that should be an important priority.
Thank you, Swati. And it's kind of on cue, you made the point about the non-discrimination and having a policy in place, because there was folks in the chat as well. I think Smriti was bringing up this point about non-discrimination, having a clear policy. So thank you for mentioning that. Vivek, you want to pick up and share your thoughts on what pathways we can look at?
Well, I mean, it's difficult to prioritize. I think there's many things, but let me come in with another angle possibly, so that if you take all our angles together, we have several priorities which we can deal with. I just wanted to, I heard this stuff around, the challenges of getting into litigation, which are just really huge challenges. And I just want to say that I think we need to remind ourselves that there's a crisis in our profession. I think there's a crisis in the legal profession, in the way it is practiced today, in the way not just the bar, the bench, and in many, many other corners of it. So I think there's an evaluation that needs to be done at a level which sounds intimidating, but I think it needs to be an honest kind of reckoning at some level. And I think a lot of this influences the way then law schools actually function. I do want to focus on the one point I do want to focus on is on, I think, faculty and administration. I think it's really important for them to be tuned in to the sort of diversity that they are seeing in the student body and the sort of inclusiveness that they need to demonstrate. And I think part of that could be, I don't know if this is appropriate necessarily, but I think some kind of an analysis of who the new entrants to law school are, what their backgrounds are, is an exercise that faculty and administration need to undertake. And while undertaking it, need to be sensitized on the various kind of contexts within which people are coming into law school, so that stuff like what Swati just mentioned around, offensive remarks being made or offensive treatment on campus are just either mitigated or certainly dealt with, because then you develop a culture which is in tune with what it needs to be. And I think, so a good starting point possibly would be, and I think, COVID is potentially a good time to begin an exercise of faculty actually beginning to sit down and saying, okay, what does all this mean that we actually don't fully understand, but we need to actually be in tune with, because that's where our students are coming from. So that we are those mentors to them that we need to be that we need to hold ourselves out to be. So I would think that that's the site from which some of this needs to happen. That is not to say that there is not problematic stuff happening within the student body itself. But I think some of the others might have mentioned that. And I think, at the end of the day, a lot of this has to be, I think, multi-pronged and coming and simultaneous.
Thank you, Vivek. So, we are almost at time. So, there is many of these pathways that have been identified, and I'm sure that we can pull them all together and make sure that they are available in a more accessible way to anyone who wants to look at it. We'll also be sharing the resources that were referred to in this. So there is a link that I am just dropping into the chat, which people can look at for some of these resources. Already some of the alum have been sharing articles, which is really useful. Thank you, Siddharth. But I am just putting down some of these other resources. And I thought I'll close with just a couple of remarks that, things that I'm hearing. I think, oh yeah, Sumit, you had a point? Yeah.
Before you close, Sachin,
yeah.
Just, taking a cue from something that Vivek was talking about, vis-a-vis offensive remarks that are made. And these offensive remarks can be so damaging, words can wound, and these wounds can stay with us
Life.
for
absolutely.
a lifetime. These can be like stabs of trauma. which are not only experienced at the time of their delivery, but they continue to plague us for our lives to follow. So it's very important that at a foundational stage, as at the campus, there has to be a robust institutional mechanism. Now, there are already robust institutional mechanisms such as the Sexual Harassment Code, which is engaging with and trying to tackle, both remedial function as well as preventive function against sexual harassment of women. And there is a robust understanding that it isn't just sexual harassment of women, but a more progressive understanding of the ways in which, multiple ways in which sexual harassment occurs. There might be, and there are also ongoing initiatives. For example, the NLS Queer Alliance is getting a code on anti-discrimination for gender and sexual minorities on campus. The SPAC, Savitri Phule Ambedkar Caravan, is engaging in a similar activity as that of encoding or creating provisions that are going to address the kind of offensive remarks or a number of ways in which casteism can pervade campus lives. There are initiatives on addressing mental health. One suggestion could be for the institution to consider, should it be matters of student initiatives? Can there be more involvement on the part of the institution so that they don't, these shouldn't be the burden of students to carry. This should be something that the institution should be doing. That's one.
Absolutely. I just want to second that. Absolutely.
The other part is that addressing these in silos, as there is a code, sexual harassment code, or there is a code on anti-discrimination for gender and sexual minorities, or there is a code for against casteism. What that does, of course, we know is that it creates a certain single axis of ways in which these codes are going to work. And this is summoning classic intersectionality in which these silos or these segments of these codes are going to result in intersectional failures, in which these codes, for example, may not be able to address the sexual harassment experienced by Dalit women. So those are classic understanding of the single axis in which these work. So could there be something on the lines of an equal opportunities committee that engages with a more comprehensive understanding of the ways in which equality, inequality, discrimination, non-discrimination could be engaged with, and provide a kind of not only a remedial function to the students, but also something that is preventive and something that creates an enabling environment for students, so that students are not involved with the pettiness of, this offensive remark and that. There is a lot of energy that goes into that. So perhaps both remedial and preventive functions could be imagined by a forum which is wider and more comprehensive in its understanding as that of an equal opportunities committee or some such formulation. Back to you, Sachin.
Thank you, Sumit. That's a critical aspect of closing this. I'll just close with 3 points, overarching points. One is, identifying the important principles for future design. If you look at even the courts, we are talking about what are the essential principles that must go into every aspect of design. So identifying these principles so that we're not looking at them ad hoc, I think is going to be really important. The second overarching point, there are financial limitations, and I have a feeling that these financial limitations are going to affect equal opportunity, diversity, and inclusion as well. And we can't assume that this is a fixed state, and we have to innovate around that. We have to recognize that if we say these are our financial constraints, we may have to invent new ways of actually educating and reaching out to be able to ensure that equal opportunity, diversity, and inclusion is happening. And I want to say this because Uma also made this point in the previous conversation, that let's not assume that whatever we are proposing is a minor iteration on what has been. Let us design for how do we achieve these goals, and then if that means unpacking completely our notions of classroom, we should be ready to do that so that we achieve those goals. We are looking at, even where it comes to the e-courts, we're looking at Justice Chandrachud talking about how justice is not a place but an experience. why should legal education be a place, not an experience? So I think we need to get past the notions of the fixities of space and the challenges that happen when we're looking at space. Finally, unlocking alumni leadership. And I think this is a theme that goes right across. I think it's a broader theme on unlocking leadership. I feel that leadership is seen as a thing that the vice chancellor must look at, or the CEO looks at. Today, we know leadership is the way everyone shows up. And there are tools and techniques that allow for deepening one's leadership and expanding one's understanding of context of where we are. So rather than things being brought to you as cognitive points, like, oh, consider this, how can we deepen just how we lead as faculty, as student representatives, and as heads of institutions? And there are wonderful techniques. Theory U is one such technique that we have shared resources about. But thank you, everyone. We have shared resources in the chat. This will be an ongoing conversation. It pertains to a fundamental character of how we want legal education in India to be. As we mentioned, it's a platform for the future leaders of the country. And hope this conversation can go on. Thank you. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to the organizers. Back to you, Mani.